The United States spends over $1 trillion a year on incarceration. That is more than the entire GDP of most countries on Earth. And yet crime did not go down because of that spending. In fact, between 1980 and 2014, the U.S. prison population grew by over 220%. At the exact same time, violent crime fell by 39%. So the prisons kept filling up even as the streets got safer. That raises a question most people never think to ask. If it is not reducing crime, what exactly are we paying for? Today, we are going to break down the full economics of prison systems. Not just what governments spend, but the hidden costs, the private profits, and the numbers that rarely make the news. By the end of this video, you will understand how prisons actually work as an economic machine, and why reforming them is not just a moral argument, it is a financial one. Let us start with the number that shocks almost everyone. The average cost to keep one person in a California state prison for 1 year is $127,788. That is more than Harvard tuition. That is more than the median household income in the United States. And California is not even the only expensive system, it is just the most documented. At the federal level, the Bureau of Prisons reported a cost of $44,090 per inmate per year in 2023. That is $120 per day, every day, for every person behind a federal wall. Now multiply that across 8 million people currently incarcerated in the US alone. The math becomes staggering very fast. And here is the part that most people miss entirely. The official corrections budget is not the real cost. It is only the part governments are willing to put on paper. Prison Policy Initiative estimates the true annual burden of mass incarceration in the US at around $1 trillion. That includes lost wages, destroyed families, reduced tax revenues, and generational poverty. The corrections budget alone is roughly $182 billion per year when you combine government and family spending. But the family costs, the lost GDP, the welfare demand, those appear nowhere in a corrections spreadsheet. This is what economists call an off-book cost. And in prison economics, the off-book costs are often larger than the ones you can see. Now, let us look at how we got here, because this did not happen by accident. Before 1980, the US had about 220 people imprisoned per 100,000 citizens. By 2012, that number had climbed past 700 per 100,000. Western Europe, over the same period, went from 62 to 112. The US went from being a rough global average to being an extreme global outlier. Policy changes drove this, not crime waves. The Council of Economic Advisors found that if 1984 sentencing and admission rates had simply stayed constant, state imprisonment rates would have fallen by 7% by 2004. Instead, they rose by more than 125%. Laws changed. Sentences got longer. More people stayed locked up for more years. And every extra year someone stays in prison costs real money. Which brings us to something most people have never considered. One of the least discussed economic actors in this entire system is not a government. It is a company. CoreCivic and GEO Group are the two largest private prison companies in the United States. Together, they run hundreds of detention facilities and generate billions in annual revenue. CoreCivic reported $1.96 billion in revenue for 2024. GEO Group reported $2.42 billion. These are not small operations. And here is where the economic incentives get complicated. A study out of the University of Wisconsin found that prisoners in private facilities served 4 to 7% longer sentences than similar prisoners in public prisons. That is 60 to 90 extra days on average. At around $50 per occupied bed per day, that is roughly $3,000 in extra revenue per prisoner. The same study found those prisoners also accumulated about twice as many disciplinary infractions. Disciplinary infractions affect parole decisions. And parole decisions determine how long someone stays, which determines how much revenue a facility earns. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is what happens when the financial incentive of a company is tied directly to how many people stay locked up and for how long. Now let us talk about the international picture, because this is where things get truly counterintuitive. Norway spends approximately €330 per prisoner per day. That is the highest daily cost in Europe by a significant margin, and yet Norway imprisons only 55 people per 100,000 citizens. Compare that to the United States at 542 per 100,000. At first glance, it looks like Norway is wasting money on an expensive system. But here is the economic twist. A rigorous study of Norway's prison system found that incarceration there reduced 5-year reoffending by 27 percentage points overall. For people who had previously been unemployed, it cut reoffending by 46 percentage points. It also raised their employment by 40 percentage points after release. In other words, Norway's expensive prisons actually produce economic output on the other side. Fewer people reoffend, more people work, more people pay taxes. The high upfront cost generates long-term savings that never appear in the corrections budget, but are very real. The United States, by contrast, spends enormous amounts per prisoner, but recidivism remains stubbornly high. That is the difference between spending money on punishment and spending money on outcomes. Now let us look at something even closer to the ground, the economics of who actually ends up in prison before a trial even begins. More than 3.7 million people worldwide are currently held in pretrial detention. That means they have not been convicted of anything. They are simply waiting. In the United States, the number of unconvicted people in jails grew by 200% between 1983 and 2014. Much of this is driven by cash bail, a system where your freedom depends on whether you can afford to pay a bond. And the economic damage of even a short pretrial detention is significant and lasting. Brookings Institution research found that a person who is marginally detained, meaning detained when they could have been supervised in the community, loses about $29,000 a lifetime income in present value terms. Pretrial detention reduces formal earnings by $948 per year, reduces access to tax credits, and increases the probability that person's family falls into poverty. One 10 percentage point increase in county pretrial detention rates was associated with a 1 to 2 percentage point increase in poverty. And the cost of holding someone pretrial at the federal level is $40,716 per year. The cost of supervising that same person in the community is $4,696 per year. That is nearly a 9-to-1 cost difference for someone who has not yet been found guilty of anything. Brookings estimated that eliminating money bail entirely could increase aggregate earnings across the U.S. economy by as much as $80 billion per year. This is not a fringe economic argument. It is straightforward cost-benefit analysis applied to a system that was never designed with cost-benefit analysis in mind. Now let us talk about the cost that is almost never put on a balance sheet. Prison labor. The average minimum wage for a prison job in the United States is 13 cents per hour. The average maximum wage is 52 cents per hour. In Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, South Carolina, and Texas, many regular prison jobs pay nothing at all. Zero. These are not fringe programs. This is the labor that keeps facilities running: cooking, cleaning, laundry, maintenance. In Washington state, GEO Group's private immigration detention facility paid detainee workers $1 per day for essential work that kept the facility operational. A jury eventually awarded $3 million in back wages to more than 10,000 workers at that facility. A judge added another $9 million for unjust enrichment. The final appellate decision left GEO owing $2 million, and required going forward that they pay minimum wage. The Attorney General stated that GEO had used detainee labor for virtually all non-security functions. That is an operating margin subsidized by people who had no meaningful choice but to work. Now, if you have been watching this and wondering whether there is a better way, the answer in the data is yes. And it is cheaper. The Rand Corporation's meta-analysis of correctional education found that participants had 43% lower odds of reoffending. That is a 13 percentage point reduction in recidivism risk. They also had 13% higher odds of finding employment after release. Rand explicitly concluded that correctional education is cost-effective because the cost of the programs is lower than the cost of the reincarceration they prevent. More education, fewer people coming back. Fewer people coming back, lower prison spending. And more people working means more tax revenue. The ROI on rehabilitation is not just a moral story. It is an accounting story. Community supervision makes the same point even more starkly. Federal data from 2024 shows that post-sentencing imprisonment costs $51,711 per year. Community supervision for the same person costs $4,742 per year. For nonviolent offenders who pose limited public safety risk, keeping someone in prison rather than supervised in the community costs roughly 10 times more. Now let us zoom out and look at what this all adds up to. The Brennan Center estimates that formerly imprisoned people lose nearly $500,000 in lifetime earnings on average. The probability that a family falls into poverty rises nearly 40%, while a father is incarcerated. More than 2.7 million children in the United States had an incarcerated parent as of recent measurements. More than 5 million had ever experienced parental incarceration. NORC and FWD estimated that incarceration costs U.S. families $348 billion annually, including $4.200 per year in direct spending per incarcerated loved one, and $326 billion in lost earnings. These costs fall disproportionately on communities that are already economically fragile. CA research found that accounting for incarceration shrinks the apparent closing of the black-white wage gap from 13% to just 3% between 1950 and 1990. Incarceration was masking persistent racial inequality, not showing up as inequality itself, but quietly embedding it into the economy. The economics of prison systems are not a separate issue from the economics of poverty, work, and family. They are the same issue, viewed through a different lens. So where does this leave us? The evidence points in a consistent direction. High incarceration does not automatically produce safety. Low spending per prisoner does not mean efficiency. It often means hidden costs and worse outcomes. Private sector profit motives can actively work against shorter sentences and lower recidivism. And rehabilitation, education, and community supervision consistently deliver better economic returns than simply locking people up longer. The countries that invest heavily in each prisoner, like Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands, tend to have far fewer prisoners overall. The countries that spend the least per prisoner tend to have the most of them. That relationship is not a coincidence. It is the economics telling us exactly what the money is actually buying. Here is what most people watching this do not know yet. The costs we have talked about today are only what we can measure. There is a deeper layer, the long-run effects on children, on neighborhoods, on the tax base of entire cities, that economists are still building models to quantify. If you want to understand that side of the story, the video on the economics of poverty and intergenerational wealth is where that thread continues.